Dear friends, tonight's presentation is a revision of a talk that I gave to an audience quite familiar with Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. I spoke to suggest that it might be helpful from a literary standpoint to contextualize Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy in respect to modernism. Rudolf Steiner's activity as a teacher of anthroposophy occurred at the beginning decades of the 20th century, and these are the modernist decades in European literature and art. So, what might we gain by reading Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy from a literary perspective? What might we gain by reading literary modernism from a spiritual scientific perspective? Now, for the most part, we are not used to reading Rudolf Steiner's lectures and writings contextually, nor are we used to discussing Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy from the perspective of literature or poetry, but perhaps we should. If you follow the work of our section meetings, you will know that we have spent several years in consideration of the literary source springs of anthroposophy, and this was done to understand the development of anthroposophy from a literary perspective. Anthroposophy's literary source springs are found in German-speaking Central Europe of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And this was the time of early German Romanticism, the time of Goethe and Novalis, Schiller and Fichte, Kant and Schelling, and many other authors whom Rudolf Steiner read and emphasized repeatedly. This is the time in which Goethe wrote what Rudolf Steiner explicitly hailed as the germinal seed of the anthroposophical movement, and that would be the fairy tale of the green snake and beautiful lily, which we have discussed quite a bit in our section meetings. Now, Rudolf Steiner's literary debt to Goethe and to Novalis is one thing, but you might think I am going down a rabbit hole, or something worse, when I talk about 20th century modernism. However, modernism and early German Romanticism are closely related, as I have pointed out in past meetings. We find ourselves in one extended landscape, rather than, let's say, as travelers arrested at the borders of distinct foreign countries and forced to produce passports for suspicious guards who speak an unfamiliar language. Nevertheless, the question is important. Why should we bother to read Rudolf Steiner as literature, or to contextualize his work in respect to other literary masterworks of the early 20th century? Indeed, the phrase literary development of anthroposophy may sound quite discordant to the ears of some persons who may find it unhelpful to apply literary methodologies to the texts of anthroposophy. Now, I can understand this reaction, even though I find it puzzling. Anthroposophists read and discuss anthroposophical books all the time. And now, true, these are often transcripts of Rudolf Steiner lectures, or they are elaborations and explanations of those lectures. But come on, my friends, let's face it. Without books, we would be lost. We are what they call a textual lineage. Even so, for a variety of reasons, I know that some readers might prefer to approach Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as something ahistorical and hermetic. Ahistorical and hermetic in the sense that these special texts are not to be read as part of a larger secular humanist literary tradition, or to find a place in that tradition. From the perspective of this hermetic ahistorical reading, Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy is unique and exceptional. It's more like a privileged revelation, a revealed wisdom, quite dependent on the genius of one exceptional author. However, by reading Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as a privileged narrative from a higher plane of reality and authority, we do limit our options for literary development. In our era, we have learned to value a dynamic discourse community of varied readers and writers, or, as Novalis might say, a dynamic discourse community of varied poets. Now, this raises the interesting question, a side question. Can one be inspired by anthroposophia without being a student of Rudolf Steiner? Does Rudolf Steiner equal anthroposophia? Is Rudolf Steiner our only point of access to anthroposophia, or is Rudolf Steiner one voice and one viewpoint in a greater, more encompassing spiritual tradition, variously known, variously explored, and variously beckoning? Now, I posed this question when I discussed the poet-scholar Kathleen Raine and the poet-artist William Blake, for example, and I refer you to that video. But for now, as we know, Rudolf Steiner read widely, he read voraciously, and he read continuously. One might say that Rudolf Steiner was a literary Mozart who assimilated everything he read, just as the musical Mozart assimilated everything he heard. And like Mozart, or maybe the better expression is like a poet, like Goethe, for example. After reading widely and continuously, Rudolf Steiner metamorphosed what he read through the creative power of poetic imagination. Footnote: I am using the word imagination in a spiritual sense, in the way that Rudolf Steiner or Novalis or William Blake used the word. And again, I refer you to the Kathleen Raine video where I explored this. To add another literary perspective, if we read Aristotle's definition of poesis in Aristotle's Poetics, we find Aristotle arguing that the main job of a poet is to make plots that make sense of things. Aristotle discusses tragedy, of course, but his larger point is that plots or narratives explain the world and human experience on many levels of complexity, some of them quite contradictory. The Greek word for plot is mythos, from which we have the word mythology. Now, insofar as a poet performs a myth-making task, her plots or narratives inspire us to a path of knowing and discovery. We learn to know or to imagine the occult or hidden meaning of the world and human destiny. This is the essential function of the poet and of poetry, according to Aristotle. And Rudolf Steiner fits that Aristotelian definition of poet quite well, one might argue. Scholars have recognized for a long time, and in fact, if you study this stuff, you can't avoid it, that the European modernist decades are characterized by a widespread interest in the occult, the afterlife, seances, and spiritualism, what we call channeling, secret brotherhoods, and imagined Asia, especially Tibet, magic, alchemy, initiation, masters, shamanism, and most importantly, dialogues with the dead. I especially want to emphasize this eruption of the unrestful dead into the mind of Europe during the modernist era. I'll return to this. Now, scholars typically put these items that I mentioned in a drawer and they label it the occult or spiritism, or, recently the preferred term is New Age philosophy. You see on the internet these days an increasing tendency to call Rudolf Steiner a New Age philosopher, as if that meant anything. And these days there are professorships devoted to the Western esoteric tradition. But as one professor remarked, he advises students to relate to this subject in the way that a competent botanist relates to a garden. Observe and classify, but don't get your hands dirty. Don't try to do anything. Don't be a gardener. But, my friends, in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities of the School for Spiritual Science, we are botanists and we are gardeners, are we not? We are poets, scientists, and artists, scholars, and meditants. To use a phrase common in the Buddhist tradition, we are scholar practitioners. Now, you know as well as I that the Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and, nearly every other wisdom tradition has similar ideas about the scholar practitioner. But let me add that in addition to scholarship and meditation, I really should emphasize that scholar practitioners in the School for Spiritual Science add a very important third activity to their definition of what it means to be a scholar practitioner. They add art. Artistic activity, artistic creativity are distinguishing features of the scholar practitioner in spiritual science. And in our section, this would mean poetry as well, or as we prefer to say these days, creative writing. To relate to a garden only as a botanist, as a Wissenschaftler, well, I'd call this a good example of the type of mindset that Rudolf Steiner strenuously criticized and tried to explode. So, to return to our theme, what is modernism in a literary sense? Well, modernism is a term of critical usage in the literary arts and visual arts to refer to characteristic gestures and attitudes in literature and art at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century in Europe mostly. Modernism is a mood or sign of the times that characterizes a European attitude toward the perceived crisis of modernity. Modernity is typically defined in the modernist context as the perceived historical catastrophe that has occurred in European civilization since the Renaissance. Although, the term Renaissance is a modernist concept. So, in a certain sense, To be a modernist means to inhabit a self-constructed prison called modernity. Now, we discussed this modernist definition of Renaissance in previous meetings when we talked about Jakob Burckhardt and his pupil Friedrich Nietzsche, both in Basel. Modernists create a concept, modernity. They then reify that concept for ideological purposes. They create an ism. Now, for example, to make this simple, imagine if we took anthroposophia and turned it into Steiner studies, and we called this project Steinerism. So you get a sense of what I mean. In the case of modernism, the ideological project of modernists is to alert European civilization to the looming dangers of modernity, to warn folks that modernity threatens to turn Europe into a wasteland, or already has done that. Now, keep in mind as well, modernists fight with other modernists. You can be a modernist, and you can style yourself as anti-modernist. It's a popular costume. You can attack your brother and sister modernists, and you can assault them very aggressively. But fundamentally, you still accept the modernist view that Western civilization is decadent and in decline, and you have a program to reverse the decline, and by golly, let's get started. Either way, from the standpoint of modernists who embrace the complexities and contradictions of modernism, or from the standpoint of modernists who attack their fellow modernists and reject complexities and contradictions. Either way, each viewpoint believes that the human soul finds itself uniquely challenged by the advent of modernity, and that the human being stands under a unique and dire existential threat. This threat is apocalyptic from a modernist perspective. Now, here's a famous poem that exemplifies that modernist point of view. It's a poem that, it struck me and most of my contemporaries as self-evident when I was much younger. Along with the feeling of dread for the advent of modernity that we hear in this poem, we find another important aspect of the modernist attitude, and it is perhaps the most important aspect for our purposes, and that is a turn to mythology and the deep past of the human being. Now, right away, if you've been attending our section meetings, you hear familiar themes, do you not? One of the key features of early Romanticism is the call for a new mythology. As I said, the early Romantics anticipate modernism. Novalis, an early Romantic, and perhaps the prototypical early Romantic, Novalis proclaimed that the world must be romanticized. Owen Barfield, a modernist, talked about final participation. William Butler Yeats and his wife spent years plotting a new mythology in A Vision. Modernist critical theorists talk about reabsorption, and Rudolf Steiner talked about the renewal of the mysteries, which he identified explicitly as the task of the modernist anthroposophical movement. Rudolf Steiner identified the year 1900 as the end of a mythological era called the Kali Yuga, or Age of Darkness. Now, according to Indian tradition, the Kali Yuga will last 432,000 years, But Rudolf Steiner spoke of the years 1899 and 1900 as an end date for the Kali Yuga and as the beginning of a new era, which he called the Age of Light. Because of this important spiritual mythological threshold, 1900 and the immediate years that followed was a time when the veil between the worlds became quite thin. H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, she also pointed to the years 1897-1898 as a critical moment, once again, when the veil between the worlds became quite thin. Unlike Steiner, Blavatsky did accept the 432,000-year length of the Kali Yuga, but she made much of the 5,000-year nodal point that fell on the years 1897-1898. And as I said, she too spoke of this as a threshold moment when the veil between the worlds became quite thin. Rudolf Steiner's dating of the Age of Light beginning in 1900 may sound odd or wildly inaccurate as we gaze back over the 20th century and its catalog of horrors and catastrophes. But Rudolf Steiner stated that an extremely significant and positive spiritual event occurred at this millennial moment in 1900, and he added that this threshold event in 1900 was to be followed by another extremely significant and positive spiritual event just a few years later. Now, from the perspective of the scholar practitioner or spiritual science, what we see at this critical moment in the mind of Europe are symptoms arising from widespread unpreparedness for a threshold crossing. These symptoms are notably loss of soul and an extraordinary eruption of the unrestful dead into the mind of Europe. I use the term threshold crossing, but an equivalent term used by Rudolf Steiner quite frequently, which he takes from the ancient classical mysteries, is the word initiation. In our 21st century world, the word initiation has fallen out of fashion somewhat, has it not? It has off-putting 19th century connotations. But don't get stuck. Maybe it would help if you shifted to a shamanic vocabulary. We are more at home with that vocabulary in our century than they were in Steiner's time. In a shamanic context, one can undergo an initiation in full preparedness, or one can be catastrophically unprepared. Now notice that a sociological, economic, political vocabulary is missing here, and this is in keeping with Rudolf Steiner's spiritual scientific understanding that historical events are symptomatic of events in the spirit world. This spiritual scientific, or if you prefer the term, shamanic, this spiritual scientific orientation is poetic and mythological, as well as scientifically clear-sighted. It is a practice, and it is a knowing. It must be clear-sighted as well as poetic for a practitioner to avoid catastrophic events such as soul loss. In respect to a literary methodology, this is not unlike the attitude or training required for a successful shamanic journey to the upper or lower worlds. It is within this context that Rudolf Steiner calls anthroposophy a spiritual science. And it is within this context that I am suggesting we might want to contextualize Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy in respect to modernism, and likewise learn to read modernism through the lens of spiritual science. Dare we approach Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy as literature and poetry? Well, perhaps. But to do this, we would need to enlighten our understanding of poetry, poet, and imagination. And it is Novalis, among other poets in that literary lineage, who points us towards such an enlightenment of heart and mind. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. Good night.